Hi there, and welcome to Be a Global Citizen, the podcast that explores the concept of global citizenship through the lens of value creating education. My name is Scott Bauer, and I'm a SOCA researcher and educator. I hope you find the discussions, stories, and insights on this podcast to be valuable and inspiring as we strive to become global citizens who are committed to living a contributive life. Enjoy the conversation.
I'm Marijke, and I'm based in Oakland, California. I have taught here and a few other places as a classroom teacher for about 20 years.
Hi, Marijke. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. This has been a long time coming. I've been trying to get you on the podcast for like over a year, and I'm just so happy that we have this time and space. And I've been really inspired by your journey as an educator, since it also involves kind of you going to different parts of the world, both personally and professionally, right? I'd love to hear more about what led you to go abroad, and what were some of the transformative moments being abroad, and then now being stateside, kind of what that means for you and how it informs your approach to teaching. So I'd love to just kind of hear from you, what were some of the milestones in this journey of yours, as an educator, as a bilingual teacher, all of that.
Um, well, thank you so much for creating this space to share our stories. I have also been really excited to come on the podcast from the moment we met. And I remember that when we did meet, one of the things that connected us was both of us had spent time in Brazil. And that was just a really lovely connection and recollection of my time there. I would say that Brazil was the last time I lived abroad. And so that was almost 4 years ago. And, but my journey of living and working and traveling abroad started when I was 3, when my family moved to Saudi Arabia. And I grew up in Saudi Arabia in Riyadh. Um, we were there for 7 years. I lived there until I was 10. So these very formative years in elementary school were spent there with growing up with mosque calls across the street, with the smell of the desert like around me. And then we went to a British school. So even just from the get go, my experience in elementary school and as a child was layered with these differences from from what ostensibly was my own culture, right? I was born in California. I'm a white middle class American. And, but that was the world that I knew growing up. And what had led us there to begin with were my parents' experiences living in Germany for 4 years, living in India for a few years, living in Spain and Chile. And so, even before I was born, and even before we moved to Saudi Arabia, there was this legacy, as it were, in my immediate close family of being abroad and being in the world, which was connected to both experience, like doing the thing, getting out there, and an intellectual tradition in my family of reading and thinking about experiences around the world and in communities within the United States. Very much, we're a family that has been based in cities, in coastal cities, which tend to be very cosmopolitan places, um, destinations of a lot of immigrant communities. And so, this intellectual tradition and actual physical travel and living abroad from the United States tradition has been really informative in my interests since then, and certainly in my classroom teaching. So I will say that before like really diving into what that means in my classroom, I spent significant time in Ecuador. I lived in Ecuador for a year. I lived in Honduras for about 6 months during my late teens and early 20s. And also, my closest friends in growing up really were from other countries, right? From Morocco, from um, places out from Iraq, from Lebanon. So, one of the things that a childhood in another country does is that it sets you up to be both seeking out and feeling most comfortable and connected to people that also have those kinds of experiences moving around the globe. Recognizing at the same time that that can be a very, in my case, a very privileged position, right? Of like choosing to move, not being forced to move, moving with resources rather than needing to struggle for housing and food, the kinds of things that does happen to refugee and immigrant communities. Um, so when I started teaching in my mid 20s, there was no question in my mind in Oakland, when I was in Oakland, that what was going to happen in my curriculum and the lessons that I was teaching were going to be about one, geography. So it's a bit of a stereotype, but also rooted in truth that Americans have limited exposure to the geography of the world. And maybe I should say instead that in our public schools, especially, there isn't that much focus on that in elementary school. And so when I started teaching first grade, that was like number one, that children in my classroom were going to have access to content like maps and geography and books about people in other countries, and also people with different experiences, immigrant communities in the United States, and the Black community in the United States, also for white Americans to have that exposure to a culture and a community that they may not have exposure to. Um, and so, thinking about exploring difference, right? Whether it's about nationalities and countries or whether it's about culture in the United States, um, it is, I think, something that can be very affirmative and positive and part of a learning process that is completely aligned with what it means to be an educator and a learner and teacher. And so, yeah, I would say I'll stop there, but I would say that that's a little bit of my journey in terms of global citizenship. I will add, actually, I will add that one of the early difficulties I had when we first moved back to the United States was feeling like a rupture between what I knew in my life in Riyadh and my friends and my daily schedule and what I was experiencing when I first moved to Washington, D.C., which was quite difficult for me and our family to make such a huge move. And so in my mind, I got very frustrated by this idea that there were these borders and that there was these countries. And once you moved from one country to the next, or if you had a certain passport, you couldn't go to that country again or move around the world. Like you might get stuck in a country. And I think part of that was because Saudi Arabia was a place at the time where there wasn't open tourism to people from the United States. Now there is, but at the time there wasn't. You had to have a work visa, you needed to have a contract. And so there was this feeling like I had to leave a home that wasn't my birth home and it wasn't my cultural home, but it was my home. Um, be dislodged and I wasn't going to be able to get back. And I was stuck now in the United States, which technically was my country and my nationality, but I didn't know. I knew more about things from about England and about Saudi Arabia than I knew about the United States. And I think that's where this beginning of, okay, so if I'm not really linked in to what it means to be an American and knowing all these things about America. And obviously, I'm not Saudi and I'm not British, but I know a lot about those places. I even had a British accent, right? And then is there another way to be in the world that is not only these categories and these labels and these identities? And that's where this idea of global citizenship and being a person of the world really started germinating, I know for me. And it's something I've sought out to reinforce with all these other decisions since then.
Wow, that I love what you just shared at the end. And I wanted to, well, first just thank you for sharing that background. What what a globetrotter you are, and I love how it ties into your parents' story as well, or their legacy, as you put it, and that you were afforded such an opportunity to experience the world in a way that a lot of people don't. And you say it with such humility as well, recognizing that, like, those opportunities were in many ways very privileged, but at the same time, how you carry that forward in a very intentional way into your classroom experiences, recognizing the kind of context of the United States within public schooling, being what it is, that you're really trying to offer up those experiences or spark interest in having those kinds of experiences maybe in the future. um, but what you just said about your this rupture, right? The word rupture is just like bouncing around in my head because I think it's a powerful word, but it very much speaks to the image of like home being where your roots are. And there can be this sense of like rupture of like when they get pulled out, and thinking that yeah, maybe there's only one kind of like ecosystem of roots that you can identify with, that define who you are, and it kind of discourages one from thinking of like the deeper roots that really tie us to the planet itself. But this process that you were going through of like understanding borders, nations, nationalities, right? Who am I? Why is my accent different? Where am I? Why are my friends scattered around the world? Um, how did you address that at such a young age? I mean, I'm sure it took it's still an ongoing reflection, but in the immediate sense, if you can go back to that moment of rupture, what were some of the things, or maybe conversations that helped to re-anchor you in some semblance of like like who you were or who you were becoming? Because maybe it was not immediate that like global citizen was like the identity that you latched onto.
Mhm.
You probably were experiencing many different emotions. So maybe you can start from the emotion side of like how difficult was it as a young person to grapple with a situation like that?
Um, yeah, thank you. I've thought a lot about this recently, actually. Thank you for that question. I think that um, these experiences that we have emotionally in childhood, I think we're learning more and more about how they imprint in our bodies and how they influence our framework and things that we embrace, things that we step back from. I have very particular memories of some of my first times at school when we first got back to the United States. And I think that that's interesting, right? That the memories of school are the ones that I have because, of course, when we got back, We had to find a home. We had to be in a neighborhood. We had to interface with the grocery store. There's all of these things that you experience even before you start school, right? But these moments of dissonance and emotional response were kind of imprinted in these moments at school. And so I think school, then later thinking about it as an educator looking back, and also as a critical thinker, I consider myself to be a deconstructionist. Like, I like taking a look at systems and how systems impact people. I have a very critical lens towards systems of power and oppressive mechanisms. And so when I think about schools and how they're structured to, in some ways, not in some ways, in many ways, enforce conformity and streamline what it means to learn and be a person. And particularly in the United States, although it's true across the globe also, there is this socialization process that happens in school that I associate with assimilation, which I associate with homogeneity and power. And so, and power imposed, not affirmative power like affirmed on top of people and oppressive power. And so I think it's very interesting that even as a 10-year-old, those I was experiencing emotionally these moments of that at school, which is a long way to like say that there was a moment where my teacher mispronounced my name, right? Struggled with my name. And that reminded me, like, oh, I'm in a new place. I'm in a different place. I'm in a place where people have never seen this name before, right? Then there was another moment when people stood up for the Pledge of Allegiance, which I seems so odd looking back on now, because definitely in Oakland public schools, probably not in most DC public schools now, people are not standing for the Pledge of Allegiance. So it's a bit of a throwback to that time in DC, at that particular elementary school. And I did not want to stand, even at 10 years old, because of my parents' background, intellectual background, and like career backgrounds. I already had a very critical perspective of the United States, of the flag, what the flag meant. My parents met at Berkeley and both had a very like leftist critical perspective. And so already the United States was like, an imperial country that was oppressive in within its borders, outside its borders, the government in particular, right? Obviously, it's not every single person. And I, and so being asked to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, and one, not wanting to, and two, not knowing the words of it. So there was also this reality of, oh, I don't know what everybody else knows. I'm different from everyone else. My name is different. What I know is different. And those were two moments. And a third moment was on the playground, right? It's that place where this can be such a joyful, loving, amazing place. And it also can be not that. And often it's a mix. And I remember watching this group of girls singing a song and um, playing softball and maybe talking about softball. Maybe I've imprinted a number of things on that one experience, but talking about softball, singing a song, and they were separate from me, and I was just watching. And it was like, okay, they're separate from me. I don't know them, and I'm not part of what they're part of, and I have no friends. And so there was these, right, these moments where you really you can see how children are constantly trying to make sense of the world. And I think those emotional imprints on me were around, were informed later my my teaching in elementary school, even like choosing elementary school as a place to teach, creating an environment where kids felt seen and heard, regardless of all the different identities they were bringing. And, my first friend in elementary school her name was Amal, and she was originally from Morocco, but had lived in Mali and was now in Washington, D.C. with parents who had adopted her and who worked for USAID. She still had a relationship with her birth mother, and she had a relationship with them. And again, here we have these situations where people are crossing borders and identities, and she and I bonded immediately, even having none of those things in common. What we had in common was being different from everyone else at the school, but also these global experiences. And so we both knew French, which we had learned in our schools before then. She had learned it growing up in Morocco. Um, and that was she was my best friend for many years, and we're still intermittently in touch. I visited her when she lived in Egypt again after that, and that was somebody who kind of anchored me at that time, like thinking about emotionally at that time. Hmm. Yeah.
No, that was a lot. No, thank you so much. I I really could get a clear sense the way you were describing school, how impactful that environment was on you, and then this process, right? The socialization, then leading to assimilation, and like the various like the ways in which a system by design imposes its will on you through various forms of power, and how that's negotiated in the varying spaces that you were speaking about, like in a classroom, outside of the classroom, on the playground. It felt like you were subject to a lot of information, right? It's like kind of all at once, and so you were observing it and you were trying to make sense of it, and your frame of reference was this life, thousands of miles away in Saudi Arabia, where you also had this feeling of maybe like making sense of what was going around you, right? You were very poetic in the way you described like the mosque calls and the smell of the desert. I mean, amazing. Like I don't know what that is, but I'm intrigued, right? Or being at a British school, so it's just it feels like on the one hand you have kind of a similar sense of like what does it mean to be an outsider in an environment or in a place that is very stimulating, but one feels distinctly more positive than the other. um, I don't know why, but it's interesting that the anchor in your life. I mean, I think beyond maybe just your parents and kind of speaking to you, and probably asking how your day was and trying to like work you through like, okay, things are done differently here, and oh, let's try to work on this. But I think friendship is so important. This friend of yours, Amal, being able to speak to like multiple identities, that was all you needed to then kind of like be like I'm not alone. So maybe that's kind of like from the rupture, um, what was able to give you hope, that you can build an identity in relation to someone else who probably was experiencing similar emotions, right? Similar pressures to assimilate. And so I think that's those early memories of yours are very powerful. And then you said that like it's probably for that reason of like the intensity of this period, that you then wanted to, um, in your profession, right, be a teacher specifically for that kind of like age range, because you know how formative those years are. And so yeah, have you always been like an elementary school teacher? I'm curious. Was is there a particular grade level, or have you like kind of worked at different grade levels? I'm just curious about that side of your teaching career.
Yeah. So let me say what you were just saying reminded me of this notion I struck on a little while ago during our class with McCarthy, in that that time in my life when we moved back to the US coincided with my parents having a very acrimonious separation. And so there wasn't really, didn't feel like there were these guides to muddle through it. I had three siblings, so there was some solidarity there. Um, so that move, I don't think every move needs to be so imprinted with that sense of rupture or cleavage or like harm. There, in this case, it was because it was aligned emotionally with the experience of separation of my parents, also. And it was that emotional piece for which I started associating the negativity of the United States, right, at the same time, that which later down the line led to other political social critiques of the United States, which is I find it's kind of a fascinating dynamic that um, but to speak to your question, and I think it's tied into this notion of global citizenship and this notion of um, how we can find, like how I found these commonalities with Amal in our experience, and how I at the same time was navigating what it meant to be part of the United States. Um, I began teaching in a first grade classroom in Oakland. It was a classroom that at the time was called a special day class. It was a class for children who had been diagnosed with speech and language impairments, and there were some children who had autism. There was some children with cerebral palsy. There was children who um, had what they call specific learning um, disability, or they did at the time. And I had never ever worked with children, even as a camp counselor or a babysitter. I had never worked with children, nor had I really even noticed children in my classroom experiences to that point, or college experiences. Like I was 26 at the time, or in any of my workplaces that had shared with me or had visible disabilities. It was almost as if there was this world that was open to me that was like, oh my goodness, here is this whole world that in a lot of places and schools, unfortunately, are are um, kind of sidelined in a different classroom, in a different part of the building, in a totally different school to begin with, right? And that was a really fascinating beginning of another application of this idea of difference. Like, what is it like when you have these formative experiences, whether it's across language or nationality or race, ethnicity, or whatever it is crosses, then these additional sort of categories of identity they become very, kind of compelling to explore what those mean. And now that's very different. There's a lot more transparency around transparency and affirmation, really, about identities that are within the community, within the disability, community of people who have disabilities and this idea of neurodiversity and a spectrum. And but that's where it started. And I learned that journey beginning then in first grade, and I taught in that class for a few years. Then I got a degree in philosophy and education in New York. I kind of moved back to New York for a little while, and because again, really interested in interrogating these systems within schools. Um, and then when I came back to Oakland, I taught in high school. I taught in high school for a year, which was like a zigzag. And that part of that was that um, I was really interested in trying to teach critical studies. And I thought that if I taught in high school, that was the space where that was going to happen. So if I wanted to teach around race in the United States, and I wanted to teach James Baldwin, and I wanted to teach, any number of people, that I could, pull off the shelf, right? That would have to happen in high school, right? And um, that was I saw a lot of that happening in high school in Oakland because Oakland is really a lot of very like radical thinkers and activists. That work doesn't always transfer to strong pedagogy in the classroom, but nonetheless, it's pretty common. And then I would later realize after that 1 year in high school that I could do that in elementary school too. And that was where my base of like expertise had started growing and that I was going to be more effective in that space. And so I went back to elementary school, back to first grade, this time though in a Spanish dual immersion school. And it was just beginning. So I was one of the founding teachers. It was in its second year and it was still, it was totally a work in progress. And that was another really powerful experience being in a space where I was this, again, like white American lady, middle class lady who spoke really good Spanish, to be honest. It was really good because I'd spent a lot of time using it and speaking in Spanish with, friends and extended family and partners, et cetera, besides living and working in spaces where there was only Spanish. Um, Nonetheless, I don't speak Spanish at home. I didn't grow up speaking Spanish. And so to be in that space was again this like, okay, like crossing these borders, like crossing these linguistic borders and opening yourself up and being vulnerable. Like, I'm going to make mistakes. Some of the kids are going to correct me. Um, but because it was a dual language school, sort of by design, what we were trying to do is have these children in East Oakland at the time, like Latino children and Black and white children, come together and learn each other's languages, English and Spanish in that case, but also learn and appreciate each other's cultures. In East Oakland, there is an issue with stereotypes and violence that happens between the Latino and Black communities. And so this school was in a way like that was part of these many ideas that we had that we are doing. But one of the ideas we had was like, okay, if we learn each other's languages and we grow up together, playing together, sharing things together, affirming each other's cultures within the classroom, then later it's not going to be such an issue, right? There isn't going to be these problems that happen. So that was for a long time. I did that. And since then, just recently, I started teaching, not teaching, but being an instructional coach at an elementary school in that is also Spanish dual language, and where the work has gotten as complex or more because of there's a lot of Central American indigenous families that have come into our school district. And so now at our school, there's a growing population of students that speak Mom as their first language, and then Spanish as their second, and then it's also learning English. So amazing and beautiful, and everything's all mixed, getting, and at the same time, whew, it's huge challenges for the teachers and the leaders and the families and for the kids to navigate a system despite all of these thinkers here that believe in affirming people's cultures and their languages, that are still learning in the classroom how to make that happen. Whether a child has three languages, whether they, any number of things that the system is not set up to affirm and help build upon yet.
You know, like such rich experiences as a teacher, and again, like the different populations and the ways in which they're they're not only like making sense of their immediate environment in terms of how their culture, right, is or is not being respected, and how they're able to kind of like build atop that. But there's also this, I think, yeah, an issue when it comes to the language, right, being a gateway into like the wider culture, right, with like you know English being widely spoken, but then it's their third language. There's this feeling of like maybe everyone's kind of at a different stage of the race, right, in their kind of lane, and that there are judgments that are passed based on where, like, how far they are, in front, or how far back they are. When in reality, it's not like a 100-meter dash, right? It's a it's actually a marathon, and and that you're in first grade. Like, let's take it easy. How do you like, yeah, it's the praise aspect of it is so important. But then when you bump up against the system, right? Or like maybe it's the grade bands, maybe it's the requirements into like advancing into the next level. What does it mean to be behind in grade levels? Um, how how have you been able to like approach that from your capacity, and also bringing all of your experience working with different populations, like within like special ed, but then also in various different like marginalized communities, right, immigrant populations, like um, it's not meant to be treated like a fair kind of like race where everyone's going at the exact same velocity running. So is it, maybe, I mean, this is a complicated and loaded question, but is there like maybe one thing that you can kind of like pull out and speak to, that helps address some of that issue? Because all the while I'm sure everyone is learning, and everyone's kind of speaking to and getting to know each other, and there's an emphasis on building positive friendship and like rapport with them. But in the academic sense, like, how does that go?
Yeah, I think I would say that central to this question of access and support is equity and intentional equity. So, mm, creating structures in the classroom, even if those structures mean agency and choice, which they absolutely should be, um, and freedom of movement. When I say structure, I don't mean like, boom, like make these structures. I mean that there needs to be intentional thinking and practicing and trying out ways that children can get what they need, which is different for each one of them, right? And it's different for kids depending on their lived experiences and their worlds. where children are affirmed for what they're bringing, that they're pushed like rigorously, intellectually, um, in ways that help them develop and at their growing edge. And um, that is what I would say. And that in addition to these intentional structures, which can be, they actually are, it's complex to implement things, but the actual things of implementation, once you start seeing them and practicing them and doing them, it doesn't have to be super complicated. So it means beginning class in circle, and the teacher sits in the circle with the children, and everybody participates, and it's not a one by one, but there is a group collective way of greeting everybody at the same time, but that each person gets to say something also. So a song or a chant and a movement. So already you're using song, you're affirming everybody, you're doing it all together, you're all at the same level. Maybe you're doing it in a few different languages. Maybe families are sitting with you, and that is 20 minutes part of the day, even less, 20 minutes. It's like 10 minutes less. um, but it's this way that you're thinking developmentally about children. So it's like we should not be going one by one. Everybody raise their hands. What do you say? What do you say? There's got to be some kind of movement and like dynamicness and like equal access. To do that, children need some practice. Maybe they need visual sentence frames on the board. Like there are these like very specific things that can happen in classrooms that speak to culturally relevant pedagogy, that speak to family engagement, that speak to children that are bringing different ways of learning in the world, meaning, or different ways of interfacing in the world, I should say. Setting up a classroom, setting it up in groups, offering every single time, if you want to work standing up, if you want to work with an enclosed space, if you want to work with one other person, if you want to work by yourself, it's like you're setting up these systems that help children feel held and also able to like explore and do for themselves. And know that after 20 years of classroom teaching, it's possible and it's powerful to do those sorts of things in every part of your day. And then you include in that, like, family and community experts that come in. You include student leadership. Who's going to lead this part? Who's going to share this? Okay, let's hear from them. And you include content like the kind I was talking about earlier in terms of read alouds, music, different ways of doing math, the history of math in different cultures. There is a way to do it, and it has to be very intentional, and it has to be very thoughtful, and it has to be very informed, not just by research, right? There's a big push for the science of reading right now, which I think is excellent. I'm very excited about science of reading push. To be honest, science of reading is based on phonics and phonemic awareness, which many educators, including my own mother, back like 50 years ago, were doing, right? And so it's not new, but it is very important that we be doing it. I always was using phonics. I can't, phonics and phonemic awareness. That's how I learned how to teach reading. Um, but that said, we need to think about how we're teaching science of reading, right? How we teach things. Because if what I've seen, disappointingly, and like with it's kind of triggering for me emotionally, going back to those fifth grade experiences, is teachers standing in front of the classroom and having kids all sitting down quietly, not moving their bodies, have to sit crisscross applesauce, looking forward, very militaristic. listening to the teacher, and the teacher points, and then they say it, and then they point, and then they say it, and then they point, and they say it, right? And so this is a very, what I consider to be like early emergent style of teaching, that you would be teaching in these whole group, everybody at the same time, teacher at the front, right? Way. So it reminds you of a little bit of a drill sergeant, right? And so that has been, I think, one of the most difficult things for me in my new position is seeing that kind of work happening in classrooms, and wanting to help shift it to something more center based and differentiated, and that is meets the needs of children who are have different, like ways of being in the world, right?
Right. And it's just the way that you described these intentional structures that you build over time into your class. It makes for a much more dynamic learning environment, and one where, like, again, you just named so many important things about like the autonomy of a child, the freedom to kind of go about their learning in whatever way is best for them. Maybe that's visual, maybe it's more like movement based, and yeah, and then it also kind of sparks probably new things for those students who, yeah, maybe their strength is to kind of approach it in one way, but it would still benefit them to know of other ways in which people learn, and get curious about some of those other systems that are in place. And yeah, I totally understand like that feeling of like seeing teachers kind of going about it in that more kind of rigid and like uniformity kind of way, because I'll be honest, like that's kind of how I initially started thinking, well, actually not knowing actually how to teach at all, and being thrown into the fire of like, okay, here's a bunch of like small like elementary school Brazilian students, and like just figure it out. And it's hard, right? Teaching is incredibly difficult, especially when you layer all of these other kind of components about how people actually learn, and then kind of resisting that temptation, to default to how, like, to teach the way that we might have been taught ourselves. And so that's another kind of thing that I think teachers need to break, and then kind of kind of piece them together, into a format that is more effective, right? For kind of what goals they have as an educator. Um, and I wanted to ask this question, because this next question involves your son, who we were talking a little bit about, before starting the podcast. He's 10 years old right now, right? And I find that so significant in that, this moment when you left Saudi Arabia, you were 10 years old yourself. And that was the rupture. So maybe could you speak a little bit about, kind of what are your aspirations for your son, as a global citizen? And maybe like at this current moment, where he's at, right now. Yeah, what are some ways in which you kind of really instill certain values of global citizenship, to him? I'm curious.
Um, that is a really amazing question. You're really good at asking questions. So, I moved with my son and my partner to Sao Paulo when he was 4. And that was like a dream come true in my mind because, one, I had been feeling very anxious about not going abroad, just generally myself, for a long time. Like living abroad, I had traveled, but living abroad for a while, I had not. And so I was feeling very like, oh, I got to go. But second of all, it was just so important for me to feel like he was going to have that immersive experience of not just hearing about other places or reading about other places or listening to different music or eating different kinds, all different kinds of food, um, or even but like even traveling to other places, that it was really important that he have that immersive experience, to the same way that you might have an immersive experience in nature, and that your immersive experience in nature causes you to value and nature. So if you have an immersive experience in another context, with a different language, the theory is you will then really value that also, and it'll be sort of fundamental to your lived experience DNA, that it will be always that you value that. It's not something you have to learn to value later. It's not like a bunch of biases and stereotypes that you have to like deconstruct and take away. It's like just from the get-go. So we were in Brazil for a year, pandemic came, it's a little complicated, our situation, and we moved back before I wanted to, but nonetheless, um, and being since then we've been here, and I have to say, and we've done some travel abroad. Um, Last summer we were in Jordan with my sister who lives there in Amman, which was powerful in its own way because all those smells and sounds of my childhood came back. And we were there, and at the same time, he was moving schools. And that was very difficult for me to know he was moving schools around the time that I had also moved school. And it was harder, I think, for me than it was for him ultimately. I was tortured. That's a little bit of I think that's obviously like hyperbolic, right? But I was very affected by him moving schools. And I like went back and forth about it a lot. The school he moved to was the school he moved from was like this beautiful nature-based, play-based laboratory school, private. And then he moved to a public school, an Oakland public school, not so far from our house, that reminded me a lot of the first school I got to in Washington, D.C. And that was very hard. I like cried the first day, and I was triggered, and I was having this whole like response. And so since then, um, that has it's hard. It's hard. It's like hard for me knowing that he's growing up in Oakland. Oakland is amazing. It's not for that reason. It's not shade on Oakland, but it's hard for me. It's less about Oakland than it is about the United States. Like it's hard for me to know he's growing up in the United States. It was hard for me when he made that transition to that school around the same time that I had made a transition like that. And that's tricky. I mean, it's also very makes me feel very, I mean, it's just, his experience is just so different from mine. And so the way I guess I try to bring that in is, um, our extended friends and family are from, are from around the globe. And also the books we read are always purposefully centering experiences around the globe. He has maps. We've talked about, I'm constantly dropping in like countries and authors, and you just try to do all of these very practical things day by day to make it so that he has that, develops that global citizenship, that or global, like a way of being in the world and a knowledge of the world, um, which, you know, to this idea of difference, I also spend a lot of time helping him through language and through ways of thinking about things where you might respond to something new with, like, oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's different. Oh, I've never seen that before. Or I've never tasted that before. Or I've never heard that before. I wonder, like, what language that is, or I wonder, like, how you make that food, or I wonder why it is that he had a teacher who had been born with part of her she had part of her hand that wasn't developed at all, right? And so, of course, for young children, they're like, what? Like, whoa, what? That's different. And so to start, replacing your words with, oh, that's weird, or oh, that's, or like, instead, it's like, oh, okay, cool, that's interesting. I wonder if they want to talk about that. So, um, yeah, so that's, ooh, parenting is, woo.
Yeah, wow. You shared a lot, and I want to also just emphasize how the aspect of parenting is so challenging, and that it also is intimately tied to the way that we ourselves went about our own childhood, and then the kind of like triggering aspect of like, oh wow, I'm starting to see the kind of like similar classroom, like environment or the school being played out for my son. And then this feeling of like, could I have done more? Should things have worked out differently? But I do get this really strong sense that with all the intentional structures that you put into your own classrooms, there's also a lot of that at play within how you've approached parenting, and that's ultimately for your son's benefit, and there is a legacy in your family of travel, and of, I think, beyond just the traveling aspect, of just the wondering of like, what else is out there, why is this different, and how do we embrace differences that really kind of challenge us in a good way, to grow ourselves, and being surrounded by friends and family who have that, sorry, who have that, is really important. So yeah, so thank you so much, Marika, for sharing
Yeah.
about that. Because I do feel like there's this kind of rhyme nature to how you experienced that rupture in your childhood, and also how your son has experienced his own unique rupture, that will undoubtedly provide him with like, great perspective as he continues to navigate his own education journey, and how he finds his purpose in life, and the work that he wants to do, and the person that is right now, and is becoming, and also as a global citizen. So I really appreciate you sharing so much about your own experiences. This has been a really lovely conversation, and you are just through and through a global citizen yourself, and you're doing really important work. I wanted to ask a question, and this is kind of to wrap up our conversation, but if you have any recommendations for our listeners, I'd love for you to briefly share a few.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This opportunity has been amazing and really lovely to be able to explore and share those aspects of my personal and professional experiences and growth. I do have some book recommendations, especially when thinking about both the toxicity of systems and the harm of systems, but also the possibility when we examine those to see what could be possible and why it's important that it's so possible. One is A Day in the Life of Abed Salama, about a 5-year-old boy. It is a true story of a Palestinian boy and a bus ride that he takes on a field trip. Um, there's another book, Solito, which is a book about the travel of a child from El Salvador to the United States. It is also a true story. Um, there's a third book that I'm reading right now called Punished, about the experience of nomadic a nomadic community's children in schools, which were meant to repress and eliminate their sense of culture. It is fictionalized account of real things. And then the last one I'll add is the Nickel Boys, which is based in Florida, also about children that are um, harmed, tortured, even within schools that are meant to be, quote unquote, reform schools. So I would say those four books, for starters, that are about children and systems. And when you read them, you are very affected by them. And by reading them, when you walk into schools and you walk into classrooms and you see the children before you, you think, how are we not going to do that? Let's make sure that our classrooms and our systems and our schools are uplifting, nourishing, and looking at them through the children's eyes. These stories are told really through the children's eyes and experiences. And so let's try to get into how the children are feeling and looking at what we're doing. Um, yes, that's what I would say.
Wow, thank you so much, Marika. The four book recommendations. You are clearly the avid reader, and I haven't heard of these books before, so I'm very interested in looking into them and learning more about the experiences of these children and these communities. And and like when you shared about them, it just really spoke to how much you really respect and value young people, and I think we need that more and more beyond just the educators in the classrooms, but society in general, right? Because we owe it to future generations to set them up in a way where they truly feel empowered to take on some of these very toxic systems that are currently present, and seek new change because new change is needed. So thank you so much. And I wanted to give the last word, any final send off as we kind of wrap up this lovely conversation.
I don't think so. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this opportunity again to share about those ideas. I hold them so dear. So I really appreciate you asking such great questions, being a great listener too.